The ground was already sinking when the sky decided to kill. New Orleans, built in a drowned bowl of river mud and broken promises, waited like a trap no one wanted to see. August 2005. The Gulf boiled hotter than any storm had a right to, feeding a vortex that roared out of the Atlantic like a living conspiracy. Satellites caught the swirl, but no image could capture the hunger inside it. Imagine what would happen when a wall of black water met a city caged by its own levees. Warnings blared. Politicians stalled. Families fled or stayed, gambling with a beast older than maps. Then the levees, those proud scars of human defiance, shattered like wet paper. Whole neighborhoods went under in hours, streets turned to rivers, screams swallowed by a tide that smelled of oil and rot. The Superdome became a fortress of despair, the air thick with heat, panic, and the knowledge that help was not coming. History didn't just record that night, it bled. Katrina was not a storm. It was a reckoning, a reminder that nature waits, silent and patient, for the moment arrogance cracks. What if it happens again, stronger, faster, when the world is even weaker than before? New Orleans was never meant to be safe. From the day the French founded it in 1718 on a crescent of the Mississippi River, the city was an act of defiance against geography. It rose on a thin strip of higher ground along the river's natural levee, while the surrounding land sank year after year under the weight of its own soil. Centuries of settlement turned a fragile swamp into a metropolis where houses, streets, and entire neighborhoods sat lower than the water that hemmed them in. To the north lay Lake Pontchartrain, a vast brackish lake connected to the Gulf of Mexico by narrow passes that allowed storm surges to sweep inland. To the south and west, the Mississippi River curved like a restless serpent, carrying sediment that once built the delta, but now threatened to flood the city at every turn. Between these waters stretched a flat, sinking plain, marshes and cypress swamps that had once absorbed the fury of hurricanes but were steadily disappearing. New Orleans existed inside a bowl carved by centuries of engineering, a bowl where gravity itself conspired to pull every drop of rain, every surge of seawater, toward the heart of the city. The Mississippi Delta was once one of the fastest-growing landmasses on the planet. For thousands of years, the river overflowed its banks every spring, spreading silt across the wetlands and pushing the Gulf of Mexico farther away. But human ambition cut the river off from its own lifeblood. Beginning in the 18th century and accelerating after the catastrophic flood of 1927, engineers built levees to hold the Mississippi within its banks. The United States Army Corps of Engineers erected mile after mile of earthen walls, dams, and spillways, forcing the river to stay in its channel and flow directly into the Gulf. Those levees saved cities and farmland from seasonal floods, but they also choked off the sediment that nourished Louisiana's marshes. Deprived of new soil, the wetlands began to sink and erode, and salt water from the Gulf crept inland. By the late 20th century, Louisiana was losing an estimated 25 to 30 square miles of coastal land every year, one of the fastest rates of land loss on Earth. The barrier islands that once broke the power of hurricanes thinned to narrow ribbons of sand. The marshes that once slowed storm surges shrank into open water. By 2005, more than 1,900 square miles of Louisiana's coastal wetlands had vanished since the 1930s, leaving New Orleans more exposed than at any time in its history. Oil and gas development carved the wetlands even further. Beginning in the 1930s, companies dredged thousands of miles of canals to reach offshore drilling sites. These canals acted like knives, slicing through the marshes and allowing salt water to flow where only fresh water had once stood. Every new cut widened with time, eroding soil and killing the vegetation that held the land together. By the 1970s, the intricate lacework of bayous that once protected the city had become a patchwork of open water. Scientists and engineers warned that each lost acre brought the Gulf a little closer, but the demands of energy production and shipping outweighed long-term safety. The wetlands that had buffered New Orleans for millennia were disappearing in plain sight, sacrificed to industry and the belief that technology could always outmatch nature. Urban growth pressed the danger even tighter. New Orleans expanded into areas once written off as uninhabitable. After World War II, new subdivisions sprawled into low-lying neighborhoods like New Orleans East, Gentilly, and the Lower Ninth Ward. Drainage canals and pumping stations made the land seem secure, but the very act of draining peat-rich soils caused them to subside. Streets, houses, and foundations sank inch by inch, year by year, even as the levees around them remained fixed. By the dawn of the 21st century, some neighborhoods sat more than 10 feet below sea level. Gravity ensured that any breach in the levees would turn these areas into instant basins of floodwater. Residents built their lives atop ground that was literally falling away beneath them, trusting the pumps and flood walls to hold back forces far older and stronger than the city itself. History had already offered brutal warnings. On September 9, 1965, Hurricane Betsy slammed into the Gulf Coast with winds of 155 miles per hour. Betsy pushed a storm surge over the Industrial Canal and into the Lower Ninth Ward, flooding tens of thousands of homes and killing at least 76 people in Louisiana. It was the first hurricane to cause more than $1 billion in damages in the United States. Engineers studied the disaster and promised stronger flood protections, but funding lagged and construction stretched over decades. For years later, in August 1969, Hurricane Camille made landfall along the Mississippi coast with winds estimated at 175 miles per hour and a storm surge of nearly 24 feet. Though New Orleans escaped the worst of Camille, the storm demonstrated the unimaginable power of Gulf hurricanes and the limits of human defense. Reports urged the strengthening of levees and pumping systems, yet political battles over budgets and jurisdiction delayed critical upgrades. The very levee system designed to save New Orleans carried its own hidden weakness. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers built separate flood walls along drainage canals like the 17th Street, London Avenue, and Industrial Canals. These walls were anchored in soft soils prone to shifting and were designed for storms no stronger than a fast-moving Category 3 hurricane. Decades of subsidence lowered the ground levels they were meant to protect, but few recalculated the danger. Each improvement project reinforced the belief that technology alone could contain the Mississippi and the Gulf, even as the natural defenses of the Delta crumbled. By the early 2000s, the stage was set for catastrophe. The city remained locked between a rising river and an encroaching sea, its protective marshes shredded by oil canals, its neighborhoods sinking, its levees aging. Scientific models warned that a direct hit from a major hurricane would inundate much of New Orleans, but political arguments and economic priorities kept full-scale protections unfinished. The people of the Gulf Coast carried on with life in a city built on risk, its music and commerce thriving under the constant shadow of water. The Mississippi River still flowed past the French Quarter, confined within its levees, while Lake Pontchartrain stretched to the horizon, connected to the Gulf by channels that could funnel a deadly surge straight into the heart of the city. The wetlands that once absorbed the river's floods and the Gulf's fury continued to vanish, acre by acre, year by year, as the calendar crept toward the next storm. On August 23, 2005, a cluster of thunderstorms east of the Bahamas organized into a restless swirl of clouds and pressure known as Tropical Depression 12. The Atlantic hurricane season had already been fierce that year, but this new disturbance carried the right ingredients to become something far more dangerous. Warm waters hovered near 86 degrees Fahrenheit, well above the threshold needed to feed a developing cyclone. The atmosphere above the system showed low vertical wind shear, allowing thunderstorms to stack vertically and strengthen without disruption. By the following day, August 24th, the depression intensified into Tropical Storm Katrina, the 11th named storm of the 2005 season. Winds reached 40 miles per hour as the system drifted westward toward southern Florida, a slow but steady escalation watched closely by forecasters who understood how quickly the Atlantic could turn a weak storm into a killer. On August 25th, Katrina crossed the Florida peninsula near Miami as a Category 1 hurricane, packing winds of roughly 80 miles per hour. Heavy rains flooded streets and killed at least 11 people in Florida, but the storm weakened as it moved over land. appearing to lose strength as it entered the Gulf of Mexico. For a brief moment, some residents along the Gulf Coast allowed themselves to believe the worst had passed. They were wrong. Once Katrina emerged over the open Gulf on August 26th, it encountered a cauldron of heat that no ordinary storm could resist. The Gulf of Mexico in late August was anomalously warm, with surface temperatures near 87 degrees Fahrenheit and a deep layer of warm water known as the loop current extending hundreds of feet below. This loop current, a powerful oceanic stream flowing north from the Caribbean, acted like jet fuel, providing not just warm surface temperatures, but an immense reservoir of heat energy that prevented cooler upwelling from weakening the storm. In such conditions, hurricanes can intensify explosively, and Katrina did exactly that. Between August 26th and August 28th, the storm underwent rapid intensification. Meteorologists watched as Katrina's central pressure plummeted and wind speed soared. By early August 27th, it had strengthened into a Category 3 hurricane with sustained winds exceeding 115 miles per hour. That same day, as the storm moved westward over the loop current, its eye became perfectly defined on satellite images, a clear, ominous circle surrounded by towering thunderstorm walls. By the morning of August 28th, Katrina reached Category 5 strength, the highest classification on the Saffir-Simpson scale. Maximum sustained winds roared at 175 miles per hour, and the central pressure dropped to 902 millibars, one of the lowest ever recorded in the Gulf. The storm's diameter grew to nearly 400 miles, large enough to cover most of the Gulf of Mexico, generating a storm surge forecast to exceed 25 feet in some areas. For meteorologists, the speed and scale of the intensification were staggering, but not surprising given the Gulf's record-breaking heat. For those in the storm's path, it meant an approaching disaster of historic magnitude. As Katrina swelled in size and strength, forecasters at the National Hurricane Center, NHC, issued increasingly urgent warnings. On the morning of August 27th, the NHC shifted its forecast track westward, placing southeastern Louisiana, specifically New Orleans, in the direct path of the hurricane. At 10 a.m. Central Daylight Time, a hurricane watch was posted from Morgan City, Louisiana, to the Alabama-Florida border, signaling the possibility of hurricane conditions within 36 hours. By 4 p.m. that same day, the watch was upgraded to a hurricane warning, meaning hurricane-force winds were expected within 24 hours. The language of the NHC advisories grew stark, describing a catastrophic storm surge capable of overwhelming levees and rendering large portions of the region uninhabitable for weeks. At 11 a.m. on August 28th, the NHC issued a bulletin that became infamous among emergency managers. It warned that most of the area will be uninhabitable for weeks and predicted human suffering incredible by modern standards if residents failed to evacuate. State and local officials in Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama faced a narrowing window to act. In New Orleans, Mayor Ray Nagin called for a voluntary evacuation on August 27th, urging residents to leave while highways remained open. By the morning of August 28th, as Katrina achieved Category 5 intensity, Nagin issued the city's first-ever mandatory evacuation order. Buses were dispatched to move residents without transportation, but tens of thousands remained in the city, some unable to leave, others unwilling to abandon their homes. Shelters of last resort, including the Louisiana Superdome, opened to take in those who could not evacuate. Across the Gulf Coast, from Biloxi to Mobile, emergency operations centers activated, and governors in Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama declared states of emergency to mobilize National Guard units and coordinate evacuations. The preparedness of each state reflected years of planning, but also exposed critical weaknesses. Louisiana's evacuation routes depended heavily on Interstate 10 and a system of contraflow lanes designed to move traffic out of New Orleans. These measures were effective for those with vehicles, but offered little help to residents without cars, a significant portion of the city's population. Mississippi officials, led by Governor Haley Barbour, ordered coastal counties to evacuate, focusing on low-lying areas vulnerable to storm surge. Alabama's coastal communities, including Mobile and Baldwin counties, began voluntary evacuations, but faced fewer structural risks than their western neighbors. The National Weather Service office in Slidell, Louisiana, issued dire warnings of an unprecedented event, emphasizing that coastal flooding would exceed anything in living memory. While emergency managers raced against time, the science behind Katrina's growth offered a stark lesson in the power of oceanic heat. Hurricanes draw their energy from the evaporation of warm seawater. As moist air rises and condenses into clouds, it releases latent heat, which lowers surface pressure and accelerates wind speeds. The loop current's deep reservoir of warm water prevented the storm from churning cooler water to the surface, eliminating the natural braking mechanism that often limits intensification. Upper-level atmospheric patterns further favored Katrina's growth. A high-pressure ridge over the southeastern United States steered the storm westward, while an approaching trough over the central plains created a weakness that would eventually turn Katrina north toward the Louisiana coast. Light vertical wind shear allowed the storm's towering convective cells to organize around its eye, tightening the circulation and driving pressure ever lower. Every variable aligned for maximum strength at the worst possible location. By the evening of August 28th, Katrina began a slow weakening as it moved over slightly cooler waters and encountered increased wind shear, but it remained a colossal and deadly hurricane. The storm's sheer size ensured that even a modest decrease in peak winds did little to reduce the threat of catastrophic surge and flooding. As night fell across the Gulf Coast, radar and satellite images revealed a storm stretching from the Florida Panhandle to the Texas border, a rotating engine of heat and momentum bearing down on one of the most vulnerable regions in the United States. Forecast models agreed on a grim consensus. Landfall would occur along the Louisiana-Mississippi border early on August 29th, with New Orleans directly in the path of the eastern eye wall, the most destructive sector of the storm. Residents who had not evacuated faced a shrinking set of options as highways clogged and shelters filled. The Gulf of Mexico continued to feed the storm's vast circulation, each hour tightening the connection between the ocean's heat and the human lives waiting on shore. Katrina's meteorological journey was more than a sequence of atmospheric measurements. It was a collision of natural forces amplified by years of climatic and environmental change. Warm seas, deep currents, and accommodating winds transformed a modest tropical depression into one of the most powerful hurricanes ever recorded in the Gulf. Forecasts captured the danger with rare precision, yet the scale of the threat overwhelmed infrastructure and human decision-making alike. As August 28th gave way to August 29th, the Gulf Coast stood exposed beneath a storm whose power had been written in the physics of ocean and air long before the first advisory was ever issued. A storm that carried within it the full weight of heat, pressure, and history, ready to strike. New Orleans existed only because engineers dared to cage a river that refused to be caged. The Mississippi, a force that had sculpted half a continent, once spread freely across its delta, building new land with every spring flood. For thousands of years, the river shifted channels and poured fresh silt into the marshes, creating a living shield between the Gulf of Mexico and the dry ground where people would later build homes. But in the 20th century, the United States chose control over adaptation. After the catastrophic Great Mississippi Flood of 1927 drowned hundreds of communities and killed more than 200 people across the lower river valley, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers took command of the river's future. Congress gave the Corps authority to build a massive flood control system of levees, spillways, and flood walls designed to confine the Mississippi to a single course from Cairo, Illinois, to the Gulf. It was the largest civil engineering project of its time, a network of earthen and concrete barriers intended to hold back the river's seasonal surges and protect the growing city of New Orleans from inundation. The plan worked on its own terms. By mid-century, the Corps had ringed New Orleans with miles of levees and flood walls, sealing off the city from the Mississippi River to the south and Lake Pontchartrain to the north. Canals were cut through the city to drain swamps and pump water out to the lake, making land available for development in neighborhoods such as Gentilly, New Orleans East, and the Lower Ninth Ward. Pumps worked constantly to keep streets dry and basements from flooding, but the very act of draining the soil caused it to subside. Peat-rich ground compacted and sank, lowering neighborhoods by several feet even as the levees around them remained fixed in place. By the late 20th century, vast areas of New Orleans sat well below sea level, creating a bowl where gravity itself guaranteed that any breach in the levees would send water rushing inward. The Corps designed the levee system to meet the standard Project Hurricane, a hypothetical storm calculated from historical records of Gulf hurricanes. This standard assumed a fast-moving Category 3 hurricane as the worst event likely to strike the city. Funding and political approval depended on those calculations. In 1965, when Hurricane Betsy flooded large parts of New Orleans and killed 76 people in Louisiana, Congress authorized the Lake Pontchartrain and Vicinity Hurricane Protection Project, a vast effort to reinforce and expand the city's flood defenses. Construction began in 1968 and continued for decades, but cost overruns, legal disputes, and shifting designs slowed progress. By the early 2000s, more than 40 years after authorization, the system remained incomplete. Some flood walls stood only at interim heights, while engineers debated final specifications. Critical sections of the levees, including the 17th Street Canal and London Avenue Canal floodwalls, rested on soft, unstable soils prone to settlement and lateral movement. The Industrial Canal, a shipping channel linking the Mississippi River to Lake Pontchartrain, embodied the city's conflicting priorities. Built in the 1920s to support commerce, it cut through the heart of the Lower Ninth Ward and St. Bernard Parish, providing a direct conduit for storm surge from the Gulf. During Betsy in 1965, surge from the canal overtopped flood walls and drowned entire neighborhoods. Yet, economic demands kept the canal open and improvements slow. By 2005, flood walls along the Industrial Canal were built to heights based on outdated surge models and anchored in weak peat layers that could not resist the lateral pressure of a major storm. Every mile of levee depended on constant maintenance and steady funding. Yet political fights over budgets and jurisdiction repeatedly delayed critical upgrades. Responsibility for the system was split among the Army Corps of Engineers, the Orleans Levee District, and local drainage authorities. Federal appropriations arrived piecemeal, subject to congressional negotiations and competing national priorities. When engineers identified subsidence that lowered a levee below its design height, repairs often lagged for years. A 2002 report from the Corps warned that some flood walls might fail if subjected to the pressures of a slow-moving Category 4 or 5 hurricane, but the warning carried no binding mandate for immediate reinforcement. The very presence of the levees encouraged expansion into the most vulnerable terrain. Subdivisions and industrial facilities spread into reclaimed swamps and former wetlands, areas that would have remained uninhabitable without pumps and walls. Residents trusted the system to protect them, rarely aware of the complex engineering assumptions hidden within its design. Insurance rates, building permits, and property values all reflected the belief that the levees would hold. Decades without a direct strike from a major hurricane reinforced that confidence. By 2005, more than 1.2 million people lived in the metropolitan area, many in neighborhoods that sat 6 to 10 feet below sea level. Geotechnical studies conducted before 2005 revealed troubling details about the levee foundations. Many flood walls were built on layers of peat and organic clay with low shear strength. Engineers installed sheet piles, vertical steel barriers, into these soils to resist water pressure, but the piles were driven only 17 to 20 feet deep in some areas, far shallower than later analysis would recommend. Under extreme pressure, such as the surge from a Category 4 or 5 storm, water could seep beneath the sheet piles and destabilize the levee, causing a catastrophic breach even if the water never overtopped the wall. Internal Corps documents and academic reviews highlighted these vulnerabilities, but comprehensive retrofits remained unfunded. The scale of the system made uniform protection nearly impossible. More than 350 miles of levees, floodwalls, gates, and pumps surrounded the greater New Orleans area, crossing multiple parishes and jurisdictions. Each segment required continuous monitoring for subsidence, erosion, and settlement. Any weak link could become a fatal opening during a major storm. The Corps operated pumping stations capable of moving tens of thousands of cubic feet of water per second. Yet these pumps depended on electricity and mechanical reliability that could be disrupted during a hurricane. Engineers knew that a failure of pumps during a prolonged surge could trap water inside the city even if the levees themselves held. By the early 21st century, scientists and emergency managers warned that the system's very success had bred complacency. Studies by Louisiana State University and the National Weather Service simulated a slow-moving Category 4 or 5 hurricane striking southeast Louisiana. Their models predicted levee overtopping, catastrophic flooding of the central city, and death tolls in the tens of thousands. These warnings circulated among planners and elected officials, but rarely reached the general public with the urgency they deserved. Federal funding requests for levee improvements competed with wars abroad and other domestic priorities, leaving critical projects unfinished. Each year that passed without a direct strike reinforced the illusion of safety, while subsidence and coastal erosion silently increased the danger. When Hurricane Katrina began to form in August 2005, the system stood as a monumental achievement of human engineering and a fragile patchwork of compromises. Miles of earth and concrete held back the Mississippi River and Lake Pontchartrain, but their strength rested on calculations made decades earlier, on soils that continued to sink, and on political decisions that traded immediate economic gain for long-term resilience. The levees looked solid from the outside, towering above streets and houses, but beneath their surfaces lay the very weaknesses that would soon determine the fate of New Orleans. At 6:10 a.m. Central Daylight Time on August 29, 2005, Hurricane Katrina made its first Gulf Coast landfall near Boris, Louisiana, a small fishing community at the tip of Plaquemines Parish. The storm struck with sustained winds of 125 miles per hour, a strong Category 3 on the Saffir-Simpson scale, but its sheer size carried the destructive force of something far greater. Katrina's hurricane-force winds extended outward for 120 miles, and tropical storm-force winds reached nearly 230 miles from the center, covering an area larger than the state of Michigan. The storm surge arriving with the eye was even more dangerous than the winds. Along the Louisiana coast, water pushed inland with heights of 15 to 19 feet, overwhelming low-lying communities before the center of the storm even passed. Boris itself, barely protected by thin levees along the Mississippi River's final bends, was virtually erased. Structures collapsed, fishing boats were tossed inland, and the thin road of Highway 23 became impassable as water covered the entire peninsula. After crossing the southeastern tip of Louisiana, Katrina moved northward over Breton Sound and made a second landfall at 10 a.m. near the Louisiana-Mississippi border with sustained winds, still near 120 miles per hour. The storm's central pressure measured 920 millibars, one of the lowest ever recorded for a Gulf Coast landfall. Along the Mississippi coast, the surge reached unprecedented heights, peaking at 27.8 feet near Pass Christian, the highest storm surge ever recorded in the United States at the time. Entire beachfront towns from Bay St. Louis to Biloxi were scoured clean of homes, casinos, and bridges. Interstate 10's bridges were torn apart, leaving massive concrete slabs scattered across the water. Rainfall totals added to the disaster. Parts of New Orleans recorded more than 8 inches of rain in 24 hours, while coastal Mississippi received more than 10 inches, saturating soils and loading drainage systems already crippled by the surge. Inside New Orleans, the true catastrophe unfolded not in the sky, but within the walls that were supposed to protect the city. As the morning advanced, flood walls along the 17th Street Canal, the London Avenue Canal, and the Industrial Canal began to fail. At approximately 9 a.m., a section of the 17th Street Canal flood wall gave way near the Old Hammond Highway Bridge. Engineers later determined that water pressure had caused the sheet piles anchoring the wall to shift in the weak peat soil beneath the canal, allowing the wall to slide and collapse. The breach opened a gap roughly 450 feet wide, unleashing a torrent from Lake Pontchartrain into the city's interior. Water rushed into the Lakeview neighborhood and spread toward Mid-City and Gentilly, submerging entire blocks within hours. Pumps designed to expel water from rainfall were powerless against the inflow of a lake. Almost simultaneously, the London Avenue Canal flood walls failed in two separate locations, one near Robert E. Lee Boulevard and another near Mirabeau Avenue. These breaks poured water into the Gentilly and St. Bernard areas, flooding streets and homes that had stood on drained swamp for decades. On the east side of the city, the Industrial Canal, long recognized as a critical weak point, experienced catastrophic breaches. Sometime between 7:45 and 8 a.m., surge from the Gulf overtopped and eventually broke sections of the flood wall near the lower 9th Ward and St. Bernard Parish. When the wall gave way, a wall of water surged into the lower 9th Ward with sudden, overwhelming force. Entire houses were pushed from their foundations, some carried intact into the middle of streets or onto neighboring lots. Residents who had stayed behind found themselves trapped as water climbed rooftops within minutes. The flooding expanded with relentless speed. By noon, approximately 80% of New Orleans lay underwater. Depths varied from a few feet in higher areas to more than 12 feet in the lowest neighborhoods. The water spread across the city like an invading tide, moving through streets, alleys, and underpasses. The Lakeview district became a lake itself, with only rooftops and treetops visible above the brown floodwater. Gentilly, Broadmoor, and Mid-City filled like basins as the breaches continued to widen. The lower 9th Ward and St. Bernard Parish suffered some of the worst destruction, where the force of the Industrial Canal surge not only flooded homes, but crushed them beneath floating debris. Entire blocks of wooden houses collapsed, leaving only splintered piles where families had lived for generations. Outside the city, the surge transformed the geography of the Gulf Coast. In St. Bernard Parish, waters from the Mississippi River Gulf outlet funneled saltwater deep into communities like Chalmette and Moreau, leaving them submerged under as much as 15 feet of water. Plaquemines Parish, where Katrina first struck, was inundated from both the river and the Gulf, creating a landscape of shattered levees and isolated survivors clinging to rooftops. In Mississippi, towns such as Gulfport and Long Beach were flattened by the 20 to 25-foot surge that pushed miles inland, sweeping away entire neighborhoods and leaving only concrete slabs where homes had stood. Infrastructure collapsed in every direction. Interstate 10's twin spans across Lake Pontchartrain were ripped apart, with sections of the bridge shifted out of alignment by the pounding surge. Power outages spread across Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama, cutting electricity to more than 1.7 million customers. Water treatment plants failed, sewage systems backed up, and communication networks fell silent as cell towers toppled and fiber lines snapped. Hospitals in New Orleans lost power and backup generators as floodwaters rose, forcing staff to care for patients in stifling heat while awaiting rescue. The physical statistics told the scale of the disaster with cold precision. Peak wind gusts in the New Orleans area reached 125 miles per hour. Rainfall in the city averaged 8 to 10 inches during the storm's passage. The storm surge in eastern New Orleans and St. Bernard Parish measured between 15 and 19 feet, overtopping or undermining levees designed for surges of 11 to 13 feet. Across the region, more than 50 levee and flood wall breaches were recorded, each one transforming protective barriers into channels of destruction. The combination of surge and rain created a toxic mix of oil, chemicals, and sewage in the floodwaters, further complicating rescue efforts and endangering survivors. Rescue operations began even as the storm raged. The U.S. Coast Guard, Louisiana National Guard, and countless volunteers launched boats into flooded neighborhoods, navigating around floating cars and debris to reach stranded residents. At the Louisiana Superdome, where roughly 26,000 people had taken shelter, parts of the roof peeled away under sustained winds, allowing rain to pour into the already crowded arena. The Ernest N. Morial Convention Center became another refuge of last resort, filled with thousands of evacuees awaiting assistance as supplies dwindled and temperatures climbed. By the evening of August 29th, Katrina had weakened to a tropical storm as it moved north into Mississippi, but the devastation left behind was only beginning to be measured. The city of New Orleans remained a drowned landscape, its neighborhoods divided by unseen currents, its streets transformed into canals. Pumps struggled to remove water, but with major breaches still open, every effort to drain the city was overwhelmed. Across the Gulf Coast, tens of thousands of homes were gone, bridges destroyed, and entire towns erased from the map. The hurricane's passage lasted only hours, but the physical transformation of the landscape, levees broken, neighborhoods submerged, infrastructure shattered, marked a point from which the region would never fully return. When the levees of New Orleans gave way on August 29, 2005, water did more than drown streets and homes. It stranded tens of thousands of people in a city suddenly cut off from the outside world. With highways submerged, bridges broken, and public transit disabled, the normal mechanisms of evacuation collapsed. In the center of this paralysis stood the Louisiana Superdome, the city's designated shelter of last resort, a concrete stadium meant for football games now transformed into a desperate refuge. By the night before landfall, more than 26,000 residents, many of them elderly, poor, or without cars, had crowded into its cavernous interior. They brought what they could carry: small bags of clothes, children clutching toys, some clutching oxygen tanks. The building had been stocked with only a fraction of the food and water needed for a crowd of that size. As the hurricane's winds tore at the roof on August 29th, pieces of the outer skin peeled away, letting rain pour into the upper levels. Power failed, air conditioning died, and the temperature inside soared. Toilets backed up as the city's water system collapsed, creating a stench that mixed with sweat and fear. Days passed before adequate supplies arrived. Some evacuees waited in the sweltering dark with no information beyond rumors carried by word of mouth. A few miles away, the Ernest N. Morial Convention Center became another unintended holding ground. Thousands arrived there on foot after the floodwaters receded from the central business district, expecting organized relief. Instead, they found an empty facility with no food, no potable water, and no government presence. By September 1st, estimates of the crowd ranged from 15,000 to 20,000 people. Families slept on concrete floors as temperatures climbed into the 90s. Infants cried from hunger, elderly residents collapsed from dehydration, and the dead were left under sheets along the walls because there was no system to remove them. Television cameras eventually broadcast the conditions to the world, showing a humanitarian disaster unfolding in the heart of a major American city. The path to evacuation had been broken long before the storm arrived. New Orleans relied heavily on personal vehicles for escape, yet census data from 2000 showed that roughly 27% of its residents lived below the poverty line, and more than 100,000 people had no access to a car. Mandatory evacuation orders issued on August 28th, the first in the city's history, came only 19 hours before landfall. Public transportation was insufficient to move tens of thousands without private means. School buses that could have been used sat flooded in parking lots. Interstate 10, the main evacuation route, clogged for miles as those with cars fled, leaving behind those too poor, too sick, or too old to leave on their own. Hospitals struggled to move patients as backup generators failed, forcing staff to keep the critically ill alive by hand-pumping ventilators in sweltering heat. Federal and state responses lagged behind the scale of need. The Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, struggled with coordination, and supplies of food, water, and medicine moved slowly into the disaster zone. The Louisiana National Guard and Coast Guard rescued thousands by boat and helicopter, but the sheer number of people trapped overwhelmed every resource. Requests for buses to evacuate the Superdome and Convention Center were delayed by bureaucratic confusion and flooded roads. It was not until September 2nd, 4 days after landfall, that large-scale bus evacuations began to remove those stranded in the city. By then, the situation inside both shelters had deteriorated into chaos, marked by heat exhaustion, untreated medical emergencies, and outbreaks of violence fueled by desperation. The social geography of the disaster was unmistakable. New Orleans in 2005 was a city of stark economic divides. African Americans comprised roughly 67% of the population and were disproportionately represented among the poor. Many of the neighborhoods hit hardest by flooding, such as the Lower Ninth Ward, Gentilly, and New Orleans East, were predominantly black and working class. Without cars, cash, or credit cards to finance hotel stays, residents of these areas were less able to evacuate quickly. Wealthier residents in higher neighborhoods, such as the Garden District in Uptown, not only faced less flooding, but also had greater mobility and resources to leave. Katrina exposed these inequalities with brutal clarity. Survival often depended not on the strength of a house or the accuracy of a forecast, but on income, race, and access to transportation. The human toll was staggering. Across the Gulf Coast, official counts eventually recorded 1,833 confirmed deaths directly linked to Hurricane Katrina. Louisiana accounted for 1,577 of those fatalities, with nearly half occurring in the flooded neighborhoods of New Orleans. Mississippi recorded 238 deaths, many caused by the record-breaking storm surge along its coast. Alabama and Florida suffered smaller but still significant losses. The dead included elderly nursing home residents who drowned when evacuation orders failed to reach them in time, hospital patients stranded by power outages, and families trapped in attics as waters rose. Thousands of bodies were recovered in the weeks that followed, many only identified through painstaking forensic work. Displacement reached historic levels. An estimated 1.2 million people across Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama were forced from their homes. In New Orleans alone, roughly 80% of the city's population, about 350,000 residents, was scattered across the United States. Houston's Astrodome became a temporary home for more than 25,000 evacuees. Baton Rouge, Dallas, Atlanta, and cities as far away as Chicago and New York opened shelters, schools, and apartments to those who had fled. Entire families were uprooted for months, some for years. The U.S. Postal Service reported forwarding mail for more than 700,000 households, a measure of displacement unmatched by any previous American natural disaster. The statistics only hint at the human suffering behind them. Children were separated from parents during chaotic evacuations. Elderly residents died waiting for medical care. People with chronic illnesses lost access to essential medication. Communities were fragmented as neighbors who had lived side by side for generations found themselves scattered across dozens of states. The trauma of those days lingered long after the floodwaters drained, shaping debates over emergency preparedness, race, poverty, and the responsibility of government in times of crisis. As the days stretched into weeks, the drowned city stood as a stark record of vulnerability and neglect. Relief supplies eventually arrived in quantity. Buses finally cleared the Superdome, and the convention center was emptied. But the memory of those first critical days, when tens of thousands waited in the heat without food or water, when mothers pleaded for formula for their infants, when the dead lay uncollected in the open, remained an indelible part of the disaster. Every statistic carried a human story, each one a reminder of how a powerful storm became a national tragedy when levees failed, systems collapsed, and the most vulnerable were left behind. On August 29, 2005, Hurricane Katrina slammed into the Gulf Coast and set in motion a chain of political failures that unfolded with relentless precision. Hours after the storm made landfall, the scale of destruction in New Orleans became impossible to ignore. Levees had failed, entire neighborhoods were submerged, and tens of thousands of people were stranded without food, water, or medicine. Yet federal, state, and local governments responded with a paralysis that would come to define one of the most criticized disaster relief efforts in modern American history. At the center of the federal response stood the Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, led by Director Michael Brown. The agency had been absorbed into the Department of Homeland Security in 2003, a reorganization intended to strengthen national emergency preparedness. Instead, the move had stripped FEMA of autonomy, drained its budget, and left it vulnerable to bureaucratic bottlenecks. When Katrina hit, FEMA's logistical chains collapsed. Supply trucks waited for orders that never came. Communications between Washington and Louisiana broke down as floodwaters destroyed power lines and crippled radio networks. Requests for medical teams and search and rescue units were delayed for critical days, while people in New Orleans went without drinking water in temperatures that topped 90 degrees. The confusion was amplified by political conflict at every level. New Orleans Mayor Ray Nagin hesitated to call for a full evacuation until the morning of August 28th, issuing the city's first-ever mandatory order just 19 hours before landfall. Governor Kathleen Blanco of Louisiana faced overwhelming demands from local parishes, but struggled to coordinate with federal agencies that required specific requests before deploying resources. Under the Stafford Act, the federal government could not send active-duty military forces into a state without a formal request for federalization of the National Guard. Blanco resisted ceding control to Washington, fearing loss of state authority. President George W. Bush, meanwhile, waited for clearer chains of command before authorizing large-scale deployments. The result was a deadly delay. On August 31st, 2 days after landfall, the Superdome still held more than 20,000 desperate evacuees with almost no food or sanitation, and the convention center remained largely unknown to federal responders despite live media broadcasts showing thousands stranded there. FEMA's leadership struggled under pressure. Michael Brown admitted on September 1st that the agency had not known evacuees were gathering at the convention center until reporters broadcast the images nationwide. Relief convoys carrying water and meals ready to eat sat idle on highways, awaiting clearance to enter the disaster zone. Buses needed to evacuate the Superdome were delayed by paperwork, blocked roads, and disputes over who would pay for fuel and drivers. When Bush visited FEMA headquarters on September 2nd, he famously told Brown, "Brownie, you're doing a heck of a job," a phrase that became a symbol of federal detachment from the grim reality on the ground. The military eventually became the backbone of rescue operations, but only after a slow and chaotic start. The Louisiana National Guard, already depleted with members deployed to Iraq, scrambled to rescue people from rooftops using helicopters and high-water vehicles. The U.S. Coast Guard, less constrained by jurisdictional conflicts, moved swiftly, saving more than 33,000 people by air and boat in the first week. Active-duty military forces, including the 82nd Airborne Division and the 1st Cavalry, began large-scale operations only after President Bush invoked the Insurrection Act on September 3rd to allow federal troops to maintain order. By then, critical days had passed during which lives were lost to heat, dehydration, and medical emergencies. Grassroots volunteer networks filled gaps left by government inaction. Local boat owners, later known as the Cajun Navy, launched personal watercraft into flooded streets to rescue stranded residents. Churches, neighborhood groups, and private citizens organized food drives and medical aid long before official convoys reached the city. Across the country, donations poured in as ordinary Americans watched the crisis unfold in real time. These civilian efforts, uncoordinated but relentless, saved lives that might otherwise have been lost to bureaucratic delay. The media became an unexpected force in shaping the disaster's political reckoning. Television networks broadcast live images of stranded families waving from rooftops, elderly residents in wheelchairs outside the Superdome, and dead bodies lying uncovered in the streets. CNN, NBC, and local New Orleans stations streamed continuous footage, bypassing official press conferences and showing the raw reality of the catastrophe. Reporters on the ground challenged government claims of progress, exposing the gap between official statements and conditions in the flooded city. Journalists like Anderson Cooper confronted federal officials on live television, demanding answers for why water, food, and buses had not yet arrived. These broadcasts fueled national outrage and forced the White House to escalate federal involvement. Political fallout spread rapidly. On September 2nd, as criticism mounted, President Bush ordered the deployment of an additional 7,000 active-duty troops to the Gulf Coast. The following day, convoys of military trucks carrying supplies finally began to reach the Superdome and Convention Center, evacuating thousands of survivors. The contrast between the speed of military mobilization after public pressure and the sluggish initial response highlighted systemic failures in disaster management. Congress soon launched investigations into FEMA's preparedness and the Department of Homeland Security's handling of the crisis. Michael Brown resigned on September 12, just 2 weeks after the storm. The conflicts that paralyzed the response were not limited to Washington and Baton Rouge. Local officials argued over control of evacuation routes and the distribution of supplies. Parishes surrounding New Orleans at times blocked evacuees from entering their jurisdictions, citing fears of violence or insufficient resources. Communications infrastructure was so badly damaged that many officials operated with incomplete or outdated information, relying on satellite phones or runners to relay messages across flooded areas. This chaos compounded delays in everything from hospital evacuations to the restoration of electricity. International reactions added another layer to the reckoning. Countries around the world offered aid. Canada sent naval ships. France offered rescue teams. Even smaller nations pledged donations. But logistical confusion delayed acceptance of some assistance. The perception that the United States, the world's wealthiest nation, could not protect its own citizens from a predictable natural disaster shocked global audiences and eroded confidence in American emergency management. The failures revealed by Katrina reshaped national policy in the years that followed. But in the first agonizing week of September 2005, they played out as a relentless cascade of missed opportunities. Every hour of delay translated into more lives lost, more homes destroyed, and more trust broken between citizens and their government. The storm had passed, but the political tempest it unleashed showed no sign of weakening, as the cameras continued to broadcast the drowned city and the desperate faces of those waiting for help that seemed forever just beyond reach. When the floodwaters finally receded in late September 2005, New Orleans faced not only the wreckage of homes and neighborhoods, but the question of whether the city itself could survive. More than 80% of its footprint had been underwater, entire blocks reduced to splintered wood and stripped foundations. The catastrophe forced engineers, planners, and residents to confront the brutal geography that had always defined the city. A settlement wedged between the Mississippi River and Lake Pontchartrain, much of it sinking deeper every year. Rebuilding meant more than replacing what had been lost. It meant reimagining how a city below sea level could defend itself against storms certain to grow stronger in a warming world. The first priority was fortification. In 2006, Congress authorized the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers to construct a new line of defense called the Hurricane and Storm Damage Risk Reduction System, or HSDRS. This $14.5 billion network of levees, flood walls, pumping stations, and surge barriers became one of the largest civil works projects in American history. Engineers reinforced 133 miles of perimeter levees with stronger materials and deeper foundations to withstand a 100-year storm. Massive floodgates were installed at key points where water had once poured into the city. The 17th Street, London Avenue, and Orleans Avenue canals, whose breaches in 2005 had drowned entire neighborhoods, were equipped with new pump stations capable of moving thousands of cubic feet of water per second, even during a power outage. At the Gulf Intracoastal Waterway and Mississippi River Gulf Outlet, the Corps built the Inner Harbor Navigation Canal Surge Barrier, a 2-mile concrete wall rising 26 feet above sea level, completed in 2013 and designed to block storm surges like the one that had swept into the city from the east. These engineering fixes came with hard lessons. Soil subsidence, the slow sinking of land caused by natural compaction and human intervention, had undermined the old levees for decades. Engineers drove steel sheet pilings deeper into the ground, in some cases 60 to 70 feet, to anchor new walls in more stable layers. Pumping capacity was upgraded with modern turbines and backup generators to prevent the failures that had crippled drainage during Katrina. The goal was not just to resist a repeat of 2005, but to anticipate the rising seas and heavier storms projected by climate models. Yet every improvement acknowledged an unavoidable truth. No system can provide absolute protection in a region where the land continues to sink and the Gulf of Mexico continues to rise. While engineers reshaped the perimeter, the city itself changed in ways that could not be measured in concrete and steel. Katrina scattered its people across the nation in the largest diaspora in modern American history. In the weeks after the storm, more than 250,000 New Orleanians fled to Houston, filling the Astrodome and surrounding shelters. Tens of thousands more resettled in Baton Rouge, Atlanta, Dallas, San Antonio, and smaller cities across the South. By the start of 2006, census estimates showed that only half of the city's pre-storm population had returned. Many evacuees never came back. Entire families found new jobs, schools, and homes in their host cities, creating permanent communities of former New Orleanians from Texas to Georgia. Those who did return found a transformed demographic landscape. Neighborhoods like the Lower Ninth Ward, which had suffered catastrophic flooding, lost more than half of their residents within 5 years. Black residents, who made up roughly 67% of the city's population in 2005, saw a sharper decline than white residents, in part because the hardest-hit areas were predominantly black and rebuilding was slowest there. By 2010, African Americans comprised about 60% of the population, while the share of white residents increased. Housing costs rose as rebuilding contracts and post-storm investment fueled gentrification in higher, less flood-prone neighborhoods, such as the Bywater and Mid-City. The economic base also shifted. Tourism rebounded as the French Quarter and downtown hotels reopened, but the loss of low-income housing and manufacturing jobs forced many working-class families to relocate permanently. Amid this human reshaping, environmental restoration became a second front in the fight for survival. Long before Katrina, Louisiana's coastal wetlands had been vanishing at a rate of nearly a football field every hour, stripped away by levee construction that starved marshes of sediment and by oil and gas canals that allowed saltwater intrusion. These wetlands had once acted as a natural buffer, absorbing storm surge before it reached the city. Their loss magnified the power of Katrina's waves. In the storm's aftermath, scientists and policymakers pushed for aggressive action to rebuild the coast. The state launched the Coastal Protection and Restoration Authority, and in 2007, unveiled the first comprehensive master plan for a sustainable coast, calling for massive projects to divert sediment from the Mississippi River and rebuild barrier islands. Federal funding supported the restoration of marshes in Plaquemines and St. Bernard parishes, replanting vegetation and filling eroded channels to slow the Gulf's advance. These efforts faced political and technical obstacles. River diversions threatened fisheries and required coordination across parishes with competing interests. Oil and gas infrastructure, vital to the state economy, complicated plans to reroute sediment. Yet the urgency was undeniable. Scientists warned that without large-scale restoration, Louisiana could lose another 1,750 square miles of land by 2060. Placing New Orleans even closer to open water and making levees harder to defend. Projects such as the Mid-Barataria Sediment Diversion, approved in the 2010s, aim to reconnect the river to its delta and rebuild land at a scale unseen since the river was first confined by levees a century earlier. Economic recovery moved unevenly alongside these environmental battles. Billions in federal aid flowed through the Road Home program to compensate homeowners. But funding disparities left many low-income residents unable to rebuild. The city government encouraged redevelopment of higher ground first, leaving the most flood-prone neighborhoods waiting years for basic infrastructure. The schools underwent sweeping reform, with the public system replaced largely by charter schools. Hospitals and clinics reopened slowly, reshaping access to healthcare in ways still debated years later. Music clubs, second-line parades, and Mardi Gras traditions returned, but often in a city where the people who had sustained them faced higher rents and fewer opportunities. The rebuilding of New Orleans became a test case for how an American city confronts both a natural disaster and the long arc of climate change. Every mile of levee, every reconstructed marsh, every returning family carried the weight of decisions made decades earlier and choices still to come. The new flood walls rose higher, the pumps grew stronger, but the Mississippi River continued to shift, the Gulf continued to creep inland, and the population continued to adapt or leave. By the time the last major components of the HSDRS were completed in 2018, the city stood stronger than before, but still locked in a race against forces larger than any engineering plan. The water had been pushed back for now, but the questions of survival and justice remained etched into the rebuilt streets, waiting for the next storm to test whether the lessons of 2005 had truly been learned. When Hurricane Katrina struck the Gulf Coast on August 29, 2005, it exposed more than the vulnerability of levees and drainage pumps. It revealed a future that scientists had warned was approaching, a world where warmer oceans fuel stronger storms and higher seas push floodwaters farther inland. The storm gathered strength over the Gulf of Mexico, where surface temperatures measured around 30 degrees Celsius, several degrees above the long-term average. Warm water is a hurricane's engine. The higher the temperature, the greater the energy transfer from ocean to atmosphere. Katrina's rapid intensification into a Category 5 hurricane before landfall was not an isolated anomaly, but a signal of a climate system already shifting. As carbon dioxide concentrations climbed past 380 parts per million in 2005, global ocean heat content was reaching record highs. Warmer air holds more moisture, increasing rainfall, while rising sea levels, already up about 8 inches globally since 1900, meant storm surges would start from a higher baseline, overtopping defenses more easily. New Orleans became the emblem of what it means for a modern city to face these forces. Built below sea level and ringed by water, it was a warning written in geography. The Mississippi River Delta is subsiding as sediment flows are cut off by levees, while the Gulf of Mexico continues to rise. In 2005, sea level in the Gulf was about 6 inches higher than when the city's original levees were designed. That difference amplified Katrina's surge, which reached an estimated 28 feet along parts of the Mississippi coast and 12 to 15 feet in Lake Pontchartrain, enough to breach the walls that engineers believed would hold. The failure of the 17th Street and London Avenue canals was not just a local tragedy, but an illustration of how even advanced infrastructure can be overwhelmed when design standards lag behind accelerating climate trends. Scientists examining Katrina's aftermath placed it within a growing pattern. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change had already warned in its 2001 report that human-driven warming would likely increase the intensity of the most powerful hurricanes. By 2005, satellite data showed that the proportion of Category 4 and 5 storms worldwide had risen since the 1970s. Studies in the years after the storm confirmed that rising ocean heat content is linked to more rapid intensification, the same process that turned Katrina from a Category 3 to a Category 5 in less than 12 hours over the Central Gulf. Similar dynamics fueled later disasters. Hurricane Harvey's record-breaking rainfall in 2017, fueled by moisture-rich air over a warmer Gulf. Hurricane Maria's devastating winds across Puerto Rico in 2017. Hurricane Ida's explosive growth in 2021 before striking Louisiana near the same region Katrina once drowned. For urban planners, Katrina became a case study in vulnerability and adaptation. Cities across the world studied New Orleans to understand how poverty, topography, and infrastructure failures combined to magnify loss. In Dhaka, Bangladesh, officials examined evacuation strategies in low-lying river deltas. In Jakarta, Indonesia, where the land is sinking even faster than New Orleans, engineers analyzed how levee systems might fail when rising seas meet inadequate drainage. In New York, the storm's lessons were painfully reinforced when Hurricane Sandy struck in 2012, flooding lower Manhattan with a surge nearly 14 feet high. The concept of resilience, the ability to absorb shocks and recover, entered the vocabulary of global climate policy, and Katrina's flood maps became part of planning sessions from Miami to Rotterdam. The storm also reshaped how Americans thought about preparedness. Before Katrina, the United States had invested heavily in disaster response, but less in long-term mitigation. Federal levee standards were based on historical flood levels rather than forward-looking projections. After the storm, Congress authorized billions for the Army Corps of Engineers to upgrade defenses not only in Louisiana, but along the nation's coasts. Cities began updating building codes to reflect new floodplain maps. Insurance companies adjusted risk models, raising premiums in coastal zones and forcing homeowners to confront the economic cost of climate exposure. Yet every new measure carried the recognition that engineering alone could not erase risk. Higher walls might delay disaster, but without reducing greenhouse gas emissions, the underlying drivers of stronger storms would continue to escalate. Katrina also left an imprint on culture that continues to shape the global conversation on climate. Musicians, writers, and filmmakers chronicled the storm's chaos and the struggle to rebuild, turning personal loss into public memory. Jazz funerals in the lower Ninth Ward honored both the dead and the resilience of those who returned. Hip-hop artists released albums referencing the failure of levees and the displacement of families. Novels and documentaries captured the bureaucracy, the heroism, and the injustice. These works did more than memorialize tragedy. They preserved the lived experience of a changing climate, making abstract warnings visceral and immediate. They also challenged the belief that disasters are purely natural events, insisting instead on the human dimensions of vulnerability, where race, income, and policy decisions determine who suffers most when storms strike. Within New Orleans, the cultural response became a form of adaptation. Festivals resumed even as neighborhoods remained scarred, a declaration that identity could outlast catastrophe. Second-line parades wound through streets still marked by waterlines, merging celebration with remembrance. The rebuilding of homes, clubs, and churches carried the weight of history, linking the city's survival to centuries of struggle against both natural forces and social inequities. These expressions of culture served as a reminder that adaptation is not only about levees and pumps, but also about sustaining the human networks that give a city its life. Globally, Katrina's legacy informs debates about how societies balance engineering with natural systems. Wetland restoration projects in Louisiana became models for living with water strategies, now promoted in places like the Netherlands and Vietnam. Instead of fighting every inch of rising seas with concrete, planners began to integrate rivers, marshes, and floodable parks into urban design. The idea is not surrender, but accommodation, accepting that water will come and shaping landscapes to absorb it safely. Katrina showed the cost of ignoring this balance. Decades of levee construction had walled off the Mississippi River, starving wetlands of sediment and erasing the natural buffer that once absorbed storm surge. By cutting the river from its delta, humans had traded short-term security for long-term exposure. As climate data grew more urgent, the statistics behind Katrina gained new meaning. Global mean sea level is now rising at more than 3 millimeters per year, double the rate of the 20th century. The Gulf of Mexico's surface temperature continues to climb, setting records nearly every summer. Each incremental increase in temperature or sea level adds energy to storms and height to surges. The conditions that powered Katrina are no longer exceptional. They are becoming baseline. Every new hurricane season brings the question of whether the next storm will outstrip the last, whether infrastructure built for a 100-year event will hold against a storm that exceeds every precedent. The story of Katrina, therefore, remains unfinished. It is not confined to the flooded streets of 2005 or the rebuilt levees of the 2010s. It lives in every coastal city, weighing how high to build its walls, in every climate model charting future warming, in every cultural memory that refuses to let the disaster fade into statistics. The storm's imprint stretches beyond Louisiana, beyond the United States, into the global effort to understand how human choices, where to build, how to protect, whether to reduce emissions, will shape the storms of the future. Each passing year tests whether the lessons written in New Orleans' drowned neighborhoods will guide action or be repeated in the rising waters of another place, another time, when the ocean again reminds the world of its power.